Good evening and good morning for those joining from Asia and also Europe. I'm Gi Shin, Director of the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center here at Stanford. It's my real pleasure to welcome all of you to the 2022 Shorenstein Journalism Award ceremony. Thanks to everyone who has joined us online, both old friends and new acquaintances from the US and abroad. As you may know, we established the Journalism Journalism Award 21 years ago to honor the legacy of our benefactor and mentor, Mr. Walter H. Shorenstein, and his twin passion, promoting excellence in journalism and understanding of Asia. Walter was an active host and enthusiastic attendee of our Journalism Award ceremonies. So we miss him greatly and grateful for the continued support of the Shorenstein family. This annual award recognizes outstanding journalists who have significantly contributed to greater understanding of the complexities of Asia. Since 2011, the award has alternated between recipients whose work has mostly been conveyed through American news media and recipients affiliated with Asian news media. Our honorees include Maria Ressa, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate and the founder and executive editor of the Philippines news platform Repression, and Tom Wright, whose reports on the affliction of corruption in Asia have made a huge impact, and last year's awardee, Burmese journalist and human rights defender, Sway Win, chief editor of the bilingual news outlet, Myanmar Now. Tonight, we are delighted to recognize Emily Feng, NPR's Beijing correspondent, with a 2022 Shorenstein Award for her exceptional immersive reporting on China under extremely difficult circumstances. I'm very much looking forward to Emily's remarks today and the following discussion about the thorny challenge of covering China. So we will be joined for this conversation by Louisa Lim, journalist in her own right, and Jennifer Pan, professor of communication and senior fellow at our parent organization, the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies here at Stanford. The panel discussion will be chaired by my colleague at APAC, Andrew Walder, the Denise O'Reilly and Ken Thorey professor at Stanford, a political sociologist, and these publications on China have ranged from political and economic organization of the Mao era to changing patterns of stratification, social mobility, and political conflict in the post-Mao era. Our program will also include a closing audience Q&A session, and we encourage all of you to submit brief questions to our honoree and discussant throughout the evening via the Zoom Q&A function. And now I am pleased to invite Louisa Lim to introduce our award recipient. So Louisa is an award-winning journalist who reported from China for a decade for NPR and the BBC. Her first book, The People's Republic of Amnesia, Tiananmen Revisited, was shortlisted for the OL Prize for Political Writing and the Helen Bernstein Prize for excellence in journalism. Luisa co-hosts the Little Red podcast, an award-winning podcast on China. She also works as a senior lecturer at the University of Melbourne in Australia, teaching audio journalism and podcasting, and holds PhD in journalism studies. Her latest book, Indelible City, Dispossession and Defiance in Hong Kong, was released in April of this year from Penguin Random House. So we are grateful that she also served as a member of our selection committee for the Journalism Award. Okay, now before Luisa introduces our honoree, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to our entire selection committee, which includes 4 other experts. So today, here with us online, Anna Fifield, editor of Dominion Post and Wellington editor for New Zealand news site Stuff, and former Beijing and Tokyo bureau chief for the Washington Post, and our 2018 Shorenstein Journalism Award winner. Also with us, Jay Hamilton, Hearst Professor of Communication, Chair of the Department of Communication, and Director of Journalism Program at Stanford. Also with us today online, Raju Narisetti, publisher, McKinsey Global Publishing, McKinsey and Company. And we have one more member who couldn't join us tonight, William Dobson, co-editor of the Journal of Democracy. So now let me turn to Luisa for introducing our honoree tonight. Luisa.
Oh, thank you so much, Jiwook. And I'm so delighted to introduce a journalist whose work I've admired for a really long time. I mean, first, maybe I'll just say something about the judging process. I've actually judged quite a lot of these awards. And to be honest, often it can be surprisingly acrimonious. You can have huge fights on the judging panel. Often everybody's second choice is picked because no one can agree on the first choice. That didn't happen this time. This time, there were 5 judges. We had a short list, which was a really strong short list. And all 5 of us unanimously chose Emily as our top pick. And after that, we also sent a long round of emails congratulating each other on how good our choice was and how pleased we were that we'd all agreed. So there was really never any doubt. I'd say it's not really a surprise that Emily's stories, her work stood out to us because it's work that really moves the dial. It breaks stories. And of course, Emily's working in incredibly difficult circumstances in China. She started her career working for the Financial Times, where she contributed to scoop after scoop. Some of them were really gutsy, but others, work that I've used myself in my research, was notable for just the huge amount of time and detail that it's taken. For example, a story that she did tabulating Chinese language publications around the world involved in China's propaganda machine overseas. And that's kind of quite detailed work. And Emily did work like that as well. At NPR, she's continued to do really important work in an environment that's become harder and harder for foreign journalists. In particular, I'd like to mention her stories about the campaign against Uyghurs, members of the Uyghur ethnic minority. Beijing has put more than 1 million Uyghurs in political indoctrination camps. And Emily has really systematically told these eyewitness stories, voices that we really haven't heard, from Uyghurs who are inside camps, from people who've been harassed far beyond China's borders, Uyghurs who've left China and still been harassed, and most recently and poignantly, the story that sticks out in my mind was hearing the voices of Uyghur children describing what it's like in the state-run boarding schools that they are sent to when they're separated from their parents in order to be sinicized. One of the details that stood out for me in that story was the fact that those particular children had been separated from their parents for so long and taught Mandarin that when they were reunited, they could no longer speak their native language. I mean, these are stories that are really hard to tell. It's really hard to gain the trust of your interviewees. And there were big consequences, both for the interviewees and for the journalists telling them. So, you know, those are some of the reasons why we really wanted to, you know, Emily's work really stood out to all of us. And I think that threat of intimidation of journalists, the possibility of visa withdrawal, that pressure is even greater now because so many other correspondents who have been in China for a long time have been expelled, you know, correspondents from the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. But Emily continued to tell these stories. And another thing that I'll just mention really quickly that stood out to me was the range of stories that Emily tells. They're not, you know, some of them are quite wonky stories, some about serious human rights issues, but also these little tiny stories, which I think tell us something that we didn't know. I'm in particular thinking about Emily's story on snail noodles, which was a huge hit. You know, a massive craze in China. And Emily went to report this story, and what happened was a huge amount of pressure from the authorities. And she tweeted about the police checks, state media campaign against her. You know, having been a journalist in China myself, I know that when you're under that kind of pressure, it's pretty easy to go, oh, well, maybe I don't really need to tell this story. You know, it's a story about snail noodles after all. But I think the fact that Emily has continued to tell these stories really shows what kind of journalist she is. So I'm going to hand over to her now.
Okay, thank you. So now, Emily, it's our pleasure to present to you with the Shorenstein Journalism Award of 2022. So congratulations. Thank you so much for your excellent work in journalism, reporting on China. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Louisa, for such a generous introduction. You know, I stand on the shoulders of giants. I took over Louisa's job, not right after Louisa left, but we've done the same position, and I appreciate her reporting all the more from China now that I have to do the reporting in audio for radio. Thank you very much. And it's such an honor to receive this award. I have serious imposter syndrome as you list off all the previous award recipients. And I thank everyone for showing up and attending this talk across multiple time zones across the world. This award means a lot to me, especially now that I'm currently outside of China. I'm in Europe right now, and outside of China for perhaps a little bit longer than I initially expected. And as I start to reflect on the unique set of circumstances and conditions that made the reporting possible that Louisa just described over the last 6 years that I was based in China. And so today, I wanted to focus my short remarks on what drove me to report on China for the last 6, almost 7 years, and also what the future of that kind of reporting for other people might be on the ground in China. In short, I'm not extremely optimistic. I think what has made the reporting that I did over the last couple of years possible may no longer be possible for the next generation of China-focused reporters on the ground in the country. Every day for the last 6 years when I was in China, I and other foreign reporters had to decide what we wanted to cover. We were faced with the question of, in your coverage, do you want to give a representative view of what happens in China, or do you want to focus your energies on the kinds of stories that would otherwise go unnoticed, perhaps uncovered, maybe even censored if you didn't go out and cover them? And I would argue the perfect reporter would be able to do both at the same time, though of course with limited time and resources, that's impossible. And so it really became the second type of story that made me feel like being in China and staying in China was worthwhile despite the challenges. But how one decides what is important and worth covering is really, I think, the ultimate power and source of bias, to be honest, that a journalist has. Given limited resources, foreign journalists in China are more constrained than ever. There's only 24 hours in a day, And the resources, really the number of people on the ground who are covering China for a non-Chinese audience, is smaller and smaller. And those resources have been one way that China has been trying to shape coverage about itself by simply reducing the absolute numbers of people, foreign correspondents on the ground covering the country. I had a look. According to the latest foreign ministry statistics, which came out in 2018, there were 536 foreign correspondents from countries ranging from Australia to North Korea to the United States to the UK to Iran, who were on the ground in mainland China covering the country. Since the end of 2018, the foreign ministry in China has stopped issuing these total numbers of foreign correspondents, but just assuming that number just above 500 hasn't changed in the 3 or 4 years since, we're talking about just over 500 people covering a country of 1.4 billion people for a non-Chinese audience, which I still just find wild. And unfortunately, as Louisa mentioned in her introductory remarks, since that statistic was published, since 2018, we've seen the mass expulsion of more than a dozen American journalists and other outlets from Australia and other countries who have simply left. People who have reached the end of their tenure in China, but whose new colleagues have been unable to come back into China because of either politically motivated visa restrictions or ongoing closed borders due to COVID. I actually believe I was only able to stay in China for as long as I did, not only because I just didn't leave the country to travel home and see family, but also because for about 3 years, I was the only NPR reporter on the ground in mainland China. And so to either expel me or block my reentry would have been to expel NPR as an organization. And that would have been considered an escalation in diplomatic terms and from the PRC's perspective. But the point is that whether because of geopolitical tensions or because of the coronavirus pandemic, the numbers of foreign correspondents on the ground have atrophied. And with fewer people on the ground, that means that individually, organizationally, as journalists, we've had to sacrifice the kinds of stories that we tell simply because we just don't have the time, the bandwidth to tell those stories anymore. In the 6 years or so that I've been in China, I argue all the time with foreign ministry folk that if they want to tell the China story well, they need to have more foreign correspondents on the ground. And only then can foreign reporters afford to tell the contextual enterprise stories that really highlight the history and the people and the culture of China. I might be biased, but I think that the medium of audio is wonderfully suited for this task. It allows me to tell these human stories that aren't necessarily newsworthy. They may not break news. They may not, in the words of financial journalism, move markets, but they do create a sense of time and place through sound that can transport whoever is happening to tune in at that time to one person or a place on one side of the world to people on the other side of the world. Of course, if China were to let in more foreign correspondents, there also would probably be more hard-hitting, investigative, perhaps critical journalism of China as well. I see that as a worthwhile bargain because we get to see a more well-rounded, holistic understanding of the country and its many facets. Unfortunately, I think China currently sees this trade-off as an unacceptable cost and would rather limit the number of foreign correspondents on the ground to their detriment. But that kind of atrophying of numbers and the daily calculation of what we have time to cover leads to a kind of opacity. And that opacity about a country as big as China, breeds suspicion. And that suspicion also breeds distrust. And I think one really vivid example of how that distrust impacts negatively our understanding of China is how earlier, or was it this month, late last month, these completely unsubstantiated rumors about an alleged coup in Beijing spread like wildfire online. We now know, because people have sleuthed online, that this rumor came from a number of fringe sources on social media, on YouTube. They were amplified by people on social media and by Twitter bots. And then the rest of the internet picked it up, perhaps because of a little bit of wishful thinking, But either way, these rumors were completely divorced from reality. But they lived online for about 2 days because, unfortunately, so many people in the foreign press corps were not on the ground to dispel those rumors immediately. And also because so many of China's own reporters are not able to report freely themselves and reach people outside of the Great Firewall. For those foreign correspondents who have managed to remain in China, they have seen the conditions for journalists there decline precipitously. And I feel lucky that I was able to see and report China before the coronavirus pandemic. But since then, we've seen not only public health related restrictions, crimped press freedoms, but also just constant digital surveillance and online censorship of sources. People who in previous years would have been extremely happy to be interviewed by foreign journalists are no longer able to take interview requests on reporting trips. It is completely the norm. And I speak only from personal experience, but I know this is true of many other reporters as well, that on every reporting trip, being tailed by people from the moment that you leave a train station or an airport is now the norm and not the exception. When I was in China, I would book tickets to trips usually a couple of hours before I took them. And even then, somehow you would still pick up a tail very, very quickly. Assuming that you could compile enough material to publish a story and anonymize sources, even afterwards, more and more frequently, I would encounter people whose names and identities were not mentioned in stories or whose audio was actually changed, contact me and say that they'd been threatened because of their participation in our story. Somehow they'd been found out and they wanted me to take them out of the story. This kind of digital surveillance not only stymies public discourse and civil society in China, but it inhibits our understanding of the country from the outside. I encourage everyone to read the annual report that the Foreign Correspondents Club in China puts out every year on media freedoms. They tabulate data across the foreign press corps in comprehensive surveys year after year that document this decline in press freedoms. But it's had a real impact in reporting because it takes time and effort away from the stories that we want to tell. And that's unfortunate for everyone. Add to that, over the last 3 years, the coronavirus pandemic. Say what you will about zero COVID and the value that it has for public health or does not have. The objective truth is that its impact on press freedoms, at least, has been extremely detrimental. It means that talking to people, fact-checking ideas, even just traveling beyond your home base can be nearly impossible. And what's been really worrying for me is how, on top of these COVID restrictions and digital surveillance, a third danger has popped up. And that's how Chinese state media outlets, local government officials, security officials have been slowly laying the groundwork over the last 2 or 3 years to cast foreign reporters as spies and as agents of foreign influence. This is new language. It's been used before, but this is new in the time that I've been reporting in China. And this language is scary because it carries real legal costs and physical danger for foreign reporters. I genuinely worry these days that China's ongoing crackdown on civil society and diversity within its borders will also eventually result in the arrest of a foreign correspondent, which has happened before in the last couple of decades, but has not happened recently, thankfully. But when you notice the harassment in person and online towards foreign correspondents and casting their work as somehow intelligence gathering for governments, which is completely not true, that has serious, that could have serious consequences for reporters. And that kind of language is particularly tough on ethnically Chinese reporters like myself. We are cast as race traitors, as somehow having betrayed the Chinese nation, even if we have absolutely no personal connection or experience living and working in China before being assigned to cover this country. You can imagine this language has been incredibly intense and the pressure even more high on the all-important Chinese colleagues who work for foreign media outlets, including NPR, as interpreters and as researchers and as producers. An example of this race-based pressure that I've encountered, what I kind of oxymoronically consider sort of this like race-based, but also xenophobic nationalism really confronted me last year, about exactly a year ago now, when one Sunday I woke up and I found out by reading nationalist blogs and state-affiliated local media that I had been unknowingly subject to a national security investigation in Guizhou province. And this investigation centered around a story I had done half a year earlier on China's poverty alleviation campaign. But somehow 6 months later, I was being informed via Chinese media that a local official had been rewarded for reporting me for illegally sneaking into the Guizhou province and using my Chinese face, I'm quoting state media here, as cover to collect potentially sensitive information about, a topic that's been reported on for years and years and years all across Chinese media. This was a ludicrous accusation, but these are potentially legal threats with serious consequences, lifetime in prison. And so as physical threats and surveillance and obstruction to a reporting mount, our ability and our time to actually do this reporting diminishes. I should say that after this investigation, there was never any official legal warning or notice that I was served with, or any limits to our operations in China. But it was really scary to go through that at the time. And I worry it will only get worse as the years go on in China. Perhaps counterintuitively, for many foreign correspondents in China, after all these conditions that I've just described, counterintuitively, these conditions meant that many of us decided to stay in China, reporting in quite hostile conditions continuously for the last 3 years or so without leaving the country because of the pandemic. And the reason why I didn't leave and many other people in the Foreign Press Corps also decided to stay for 3 years was because it was either really, really hard getting back into the country, or in my case, impossible for a good number of years during the pandemic. So I applaud many of my colleagues in the Foreign Press Corps who stuck with it and stayed in China and helped keep my spirits up for the last 3 years. But the reason we stayed on, and the reason why I clung on to staying in China, was because, and I still believe, that China is one of the most important stories right now in the world. And it's always worth having reporters on the ground there. Unfortunately, after 3 years of hanging on, I too am now out of China. I did manage to dodge expulsions, government audits, other interference in our reporting. But in the end, after an agreement between the US and China that would, in theory, allow me to return back into China if I left, I decided to take a few months break out of the country, and am finding it very difficult to go back now. I am actively working to return, and I hope to get back to China, which is a country that I've loved living in and working in as soon as possible. But this extended period outside the country has led me to reflect on what the absence of real access to China means. Where can China reporting go when people who want to tell the China story are not able to enter the country? There has been a shift to remote reporting. So not only doing China reporting outside of reporting, but also relying on different sources of information. Traditionally in journalism, we talk to people, we travel to places and we meet people, but I find more and more that my reporting and other people's reporting on China is relying on data. And the advantages of this is obvious because, for example, you might be blocked access to a detention camp in Xinjiang, but it's really, really hard to block access to satellite imagery, for example, of these detention camps. And so I think this opens up a whole new area of China reporting that is reliant on data journalism. Also, very intriguingly, there's been a new beat emerging, and that's kind of the story of China and the rest of the world. How China is having an influence on all manners of countries and sectors, but reported from outside of China. This means that we do need more Chinese-speaking, China-experienced reporters who can report on China's influence in the world and perceptions of China around the world outside the country. And some of the most interesting stories I've read so far, whether it's mining in Africa or today, a Chinese American gangster in Mexico laundering money for Latin American cartels, or the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia, or the shift in supply chains to other countries other than China. all this is related to China, and people are finding ways to connect the dots and mobilize resources in the newsroom to make sense of this. And that's crucial. And I look forward to doing that work. But at the same time, we lose a lot in the process of reconfiguring our knowledge of China without actually being in the country. We lose a lot of the cultural context and the human reporting when we do remote reporting. And that kind of in-country reporting helped us make sense of the facts and the figures that come out of this massive country, this land of big numbers, especially when sometimes those statistics are not always trustworthy. But worryingly, China seems to be okay with cutting off this access, not only to its own reporters, to Chinese reporters who are in China reporting for domestic outlets, but also for foreign coverage. China has been super careful not to expel any entire media organization, but rather their technique has been to whittle down the number of foreign correspondents assigned to each outlet to just one person in the country over the last 3 years. And the result is, and I can speak to this with personal experience, the result is that the remaining correspondent is usually so overwhelmed with news and with work that they can really only report the headlines, the top line, if you will, of whatever latest foreign ministry press conference or state council presser has gone on. And that can make for really dry coverage. And perhaps that even diminishes global interest in China, but that seems to be what China wants, the appearance of foreign media coverage of China without actually getting to the heart of what is going on in the country and to talk to people who are making what's happening, making the stories happen in China. And so that's why I worry about the future of China reporting. I don't worry that China is about to take over the world or invade Taiwan, but I do worry that in the off chance that that does happen, that we're not going to have enough correspondents on the ground to make sense of that. There is no next generation of China correspondents either, who I see currently building up experience to take up reporting for when inevitably I move on and other correspondents move on from their China reporting. It used to be that there was always kind of a generation of people who were studying Chinese or who were working on the ground in China and building up their coverage to the point where they would then take over. But right now, foreign correspondents are really only leaving China, and there's no new young academics or journalists who want to come to the country, and those who want to are not able to because of closed borders. And so in this vacuum of explanatory or investigative or just simply empathetic reporting about the country, I fear that we begin to accelerate towards more misunderstanding, more distrust, and perhaps even conflict. And so I look forward to going back and reporting in the country if I can. But I really hope that other people take up the mantle soon in the future. With that, I'm happy to take questions. And thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Those comments were cogent and stimulating, but at the same time, I'm afraid a bit depressing. I have a lot of questions that I would want to interject, but my job at this point is to introduce our two panelists. And I'll start with Jennifer Pan, who's, I think, agreed to go first. Jennifer is my colleague at Stanford. She's a political scientist in Stanford's Department of Communication, and she's also a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute of International Studies. Her research is on political communication and authoritarian politics with a focus on China. She uses experimental and computational methods with large-scale data sets on political activity in China to answer questions about how autocracies use political censorship, propaganda, and information manipulation in the digital age and how preferences and behaviors might be shaped as a result. And I'm struck by your comments of the underlying theme that a lot of what China does in this realm of trying to control what foreign reporters do in China is self-defeating. And actually, that's a theme about a lot of foreign policy in China these days, but maybe we'll just leave it focused. So Jennifer, why don't you have the first word, and then we'll turn it over to Louisa as well.
Great. First, I just want to thank Emily for your reporting and also for your remarks here. What you talked about just now brings two main points. to mind for me. One is, what is the function of media for the Chinese Communist Party? And the second is just the rise of digital repression. So on the first point, I think your remarks really highlighted that fundamentally media of all forms, broadcast media, social media, in China is a vehicle for the Chinese Communist Party to preserve its power and stay in power. That is the function of media, I think, from the perspective of the party, and we've seen that in policy documents. But we, through your remarks, hear how it plays out in reality. And one other thing that your remarks raise is that we've known for a long time the Chinese government works very hard to dominate public attention and control the domestic information environment. It does that by controlling media, traditional media formats, TV, radio, newspapers. It does that by, we've seen this exponential proliferation of government and party-related accounts on Weibo, Weixin, Douyin. We've seen stringent controls of inflows of information. But what you are talking about suggests that perhaps the Chinese government is increasingly also working to limit what the world can know about China. So part of this may be because reporting by you and others for a foreign audience makes its way back to domestic audiences in China. But part of this may also be because the Chinese government wants to just increase its control over what all publics, audiences in China, outside of China, know about China. So the Chinese government thinks they can tell China's story better. But I think to Andy's point, this is not very clear. We know that by limiting access to foreign correspondents, the world will probably know less about China. But it's less clear whether this outcome will produce what the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party wants. So it's very unclear whether this is advantageous in the long term for the Communist Party and the government. The second kind of very separate thing that your remarks highlight, I think, is just this rise in digital repression in China. And also, we've seen this rise in countries all over the world. So digital repression, just to make sure we're all on the same page when I'm using this term, what I mean is that actions are aimed at a target, like a journalist, that target's costs of action in contention with the state, as well as the use of digital media to raise the costs of contention, wherever that contention takes place, whether in the real world or online. And so digital repression includes traditional measures like surveillance, arrests, which have been around for a long time, but these things make it more costly for journalists to report. I think digital repression also includes digital censorship in all its forms that makes it harder for journalists to source stories, to get in touch with sources, to reach audiences, as well as kind of influencing the production and consumption of information. So disinformation campaigns, cyber harassment that undermine journalists and their work, as well as kind of redirect public attention from issues that journalists are reporting on when that reporting actually gets out. So I think all together, what it means is that today the Chinese government has many levers at its disposal, even beyond limiting access to foreign correspondents to the country, to constrain not only the activities of journalists, but also to limit their reach and influence. And so I think the digital repression story is a very kind of depressing one from the perspective of independent media. But then I think this broader point is whether all of these efforts actually, even from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese regime, serve its purposes. But again, just thanks so much to Emily for your reporting and to your remarks here today.
Thank you, Jennifer. Louisa, would you like to add your comments before we ask if Emily would like to respond?
Sorry, I was just struck when Emily was speaking as to how different the news environment has, how hard it's become in the time since I've been there. And I think also how kind of targeted and personal the intimidation has become. And I think that's something that's really hard for journalists to deal with. There was a really interesting report by ASPI, which is a think tank here in Australia, which commented on how, in particular, journalists, female journalists of Asian backgrounds are targeted, and female sort of prominent figures of Asian backgrounds are targeted and the kinds of tactics that are used against them on social media. And I think those kind of tactics are feel just incredibly personal, especially, you know, some of the ways in which they're used. I mean, a journalist that I know personally had a video, like a pornographic video, where somebody else's face was placed, her face was placed on somebody else's body, and this was circulated on the internet. That kind of thing is just appalling. So I thought that was something that really jumped out at me. I've been interested since I left in the sort of the other side of the campaign to marginalize foreign journalists and to cut down on the coverage coming out of China. What else is kind of filling that void? And one of the things that I've been looking at, together with the International Federation of Journalists, is how China is really trying to shape that story. And it's really a singular story, the China story as seen by China, by bypassing resident correspondents based in China, people like Emily, who can speak Chinese, who studied China, who know the background. And instead they're going, approaching local journalists in different countries and offering these all expenses paid trips, training sessions, all kinds of equipment sometimes, all kinds of different enticements to report on China. And of course, these are quite popular if you're a journalist in Pakistan or Bangladesh and you know, your news outlet doesn't have enough money to have a permanent China correspondent, and someone is saying, I'll give you an all expenses paid trip to China, then, you know, you're quite likely to take it up. In our research, we looked at, we surveyed 58 global journalism unions in different countries, and journalists in half those countries had been on these free trips. But what was telling was how popular they were in some countries. So for example, in Myanmar, we did a roundtable about 8 journalists, and all of them had been on free trips to China, and one of them had been 9 times. So in certain countries, particularly on China's periphery, there's a very, very targeted effort to tell a particular China story. And the way that this is, you know, being rolled out is also really interesting, you know, when, as pertains to the way the political indoctrination camps that were opened in Xinjiang, there were particular campaigns to target journalists and influencers in Muslim countries and bring them on these special tours. They're called Silk Road Celebrity China Tours. And some of them were even taken to these indoctrination camps. And you know, it's not really journalism. Journalists were taken on tours, they were given interpreters, they were watched at all times, and they reported in ways that were really, you know, all of their reports were very favorable to China and really took the Chinese line that these were vocational training camps designed to combat extremism. And then at the same time, these journalists were featured on China's news, on the CCTV evening news and on the front page of the newspapers, you know, talking about what a great job China had become. So, you know, you can really see how the media has become a tool, and foreign journalists are being used to legitimize and validate China's tactics. And I think that's why it's so important that we have these voices on the ground that are telling other stories. But it's also why that work is, I think, you know, becoming harder and harder to do. But I think it speaks to, as Jennifer just said, the importance of the media and of what China, you know, calls discourse power. Just how important that is to China, the telling the China story and telling it in a particular way. I mean, I guess I'll stop now.
Well, before I turn this back over to Emily for her responses, I just thought I'd pick up one theme that Louisa emphasized, and actually I think Jennifer mentioned as well, and that is that nothing is more useful to the propaganda apparatus in China than to have foreigners say things that fit with their message. And that's what Louise is talking about. Of course, this kind of propaganda goes all the way back to the Stalin era in the Soviet Union, where you had people coming back and saying, I've seen the future and it works. And nothing is more powerful. This is certainly true in the Mao era, where you had the Canghao Xiaoxi, the reference news, where they would translate things from the foreign press that supported the propaganda line inside China. And so it's often been seen as a more powerful message that supports what the regime is trying to make. And I guess if I could add one question for Emily, it sounds like, I mean, I've been around in following reporting in China since the early 1980s, and it seems to me things have gotten an awful lot worse over the decades, and perhaps this is accelerated in the last 5 or 10 years. Would you agree with that?
In some ways, I consider myself lucky because I moved to China at the end of 2015. And that's really when, I moved to China, I think the week before the 705 lawyers crackdown. And basically the only experience that I've had reporting in China has been under this slowly, and now I think accelerating, tightening political vise over the country. That really trains you to work under difficult circumstances. And so your baseline is quite difficult. And so in some ways, like, I haven't really been spoiled by previous eras of more political liberalness. But that being said, I read with envy some of the kinds of stories that other foreign correspondents have managed to get over the decades, just incredibly rich, detailed portraits of people or of places that probably took months of travel and research to put together, but just gave people so much access into what it was like to see and live through these events. That kind of reporting, I think, creates a lot of sympathy and interest in a country. But of course, the response to that kind of reporting can't be controlled and it can't be predicted. And so we may have more stodgy, just boring, bland coverage of China from the few remaining correspondents who are there on the ground. That, I think, is to China's detriment. But at the very least, that can be predicted and it can be measured by people in China who are looking at how coverage and reception to Chinese information is being controlled. I'll also say that this perception, which is very much grounded in reality, that China does control information flows, also discredits real, legitimate, very, very good reporting from Chinese outlets by Chinese journalists that's still going on to some extent in the country, because there is this negative perception that anything that comes out of China must be somehow untrue, or is filtered through a different perspective, or somehow incomplete. And I still look to Chinese media all the time for inspiration to my own reporting. It's not as diverse as it used to be. Certainly the volume of stories coming out is not as high anymore, but it's still there. Regarding Louise's remarks about how personal this kind of targeting can be, for a long, long time, I didn't really confront it. One, it felt a little bit self-indulgent to say, oh, woe is me, why are people being so mean to me? Because as a journalist, you really just don't want to make yourself the story. In fact, it's a little bit insulting sometimes to conclude that the kind of harassment or interference you're experiencing may be because of your gender or ethnicity, things that you can't control. You would rather be targeted, say, for your excellent coverage. But over the years, I've just kind of been forced to conclude that gender and ethnicity are a real part of not just the personal online response from listeners and readers to coverage, but also from state-related organs and institutions as well. And that's unfortunate because as I've done reporting around the world, there are different challenges to different types of reporting. Over the summer, I did a short stint in Ukraine. And for that, you have a certain set of risks and you take mitigation measures and you prepare for all outcomes, but you at least feel that 60, 70% of these risks are somehow under your control. And unfortunately for China reporters, or really anyone who sinks a good amount of time into investing in understanding China, oftentimes your access to the country relies on factors beyond anything you can control. There's just so many tripwires. What nationality are you? What gender are you? Do you speak Chinese? What ethnicity are you? Are you happening to enter the country at a particularly politically tense moment? Did your country do something to China or a Chinese journalist as you are applying for a visa? And at any moment, that access can be cut off for your coverage, or for sometimes factors that are completely unrelated to your personal decisions and your ability to cover the country. And that can be quite terrifying, because people often see their investment in a country suddenly upended.
Oh, I'm sorry. You cut out just for a second. So you're finished. Your comments are finished. I have one question, unless Jennifer or Louisa want to follow up on something you've just said. But when I hear about these things, I've thought about this a long time, and for a long time, and I wonder if you feel that this kind of treatment is something that governments should get involved in. I mean, the lack of symmetry and reciprocity in the treatment of journalists and reporters in the United States or Australia versus in China is just way, way out of whack. I mean, if you're looking at the numbers of reporters who are there, the open operations of Chinese news programs in the United States, for example, they have more than 100 reporters in Times Square for China Global Network News. Obviously, this is something that China would not permit in the United States. Should the governments get involved, even if it's simply diplomatic protests, or maybe demanding reciprocity in the numbers of visas that are given? I guess what I'm asking is, do you feel like governments of the reporters' countries are not standing up for reporters in the way that they would get exercised about supplies of microchips, for example?
So I think that governments have been more active on press freedoms, to their credit, and it's been something that the US government has cared more about for various reasons over the last, during this administration and also the past one, for better or worse. But the problem is that when we start measuring press freedom and media access in terms of whether or not it's reciprocal, and when we're starting out from such unequal footing, you often end up with outcomes that are even worse than what you started with. So to demand that somehow we want one-for-one reciprocity in terms of visas, or to somehow quantify the qualitative aspects of what it's like to operate as a journalist on the ground in China or the US, that often leads to a race to the bottom, particularly when the priorities of the two parties at the negotiating table are completely different. One, the US, if we want to talk about the US example, we started out with just far fewer journalists on the ground, bargaining chips, if we want to use the cold language of negotiation, to work with, than Chinese outlets had in the US. And so we were starting out with different positions. The reason why we want foreign correspondents on the ground in China, I think, is very different than the priorities that the Chinese government has for Chinese reporters in the US. To some extent, there actually isn't a huge need for China to rely on its own reporters to gather information about how American politics works or what American people think, because we have an open press. And if we could translate those remarks into Chinese, which people do, 参考消息is still very much going on in China. I know because they used to copy my articles in the Financial Times all the time. Then they would understand how the country works. Whereas we don't have that kind of access without foreign correspondents and a free Chinese press on the ground in China. And so that also leads to a distortion, I think, of outcomes. And unfortunately, under the language of reciprocity, I think press freedoms and the number of journalists and foreign correspondents for the US and US outlets in China has only decreased. So that strategy just has not worked. But continuing to press for press freedoms diplomatically and I think that is necessary. But we cannot calculate one-to-one how many correspondents we want on the ground and expect that to affect China's behavior.
So there's no easy fix, unfortunately.
No easy fix. And I think that the trends we're already seeing with remote reporting, people setting up bureaus outside of China to cover China, using data journalism and other multimedia sources of information to report on the country, and reconfiguring newsrooms so that you find synergies between different regional hubs and expertise from reporters there to tell stories that are not geographically limited to just one place. Those have all been incredibly positive, but all that we gain from that kind of reporting also means that we lose some stuff. And that's the kind of contextual human on the ground reporting that I was talking about earlier, and that I just don't think is going to be very possible going forward.
So Jennifer or Louisa, do you have any additional points you want to make? I wonder what Louisa thinks about my fantasy that we can somehow demand more reciprocity, and that might have some positive effect without, I've heard the race to the bottom argument, but when you have 5 reporters in the country, the bottom's pretty close.
I guess one of the issues is in trying to model how free and open press works. If you start limiting, then it's self-defeating. But I would say I think there's definitely more space for diplomats and foreign governments to stand up more for media freedoms. When I was there was a definite trend where certain people who, if you had a passport from one place, but you worked for a news organization from another place, that made you incredibly vulnerable. And I myself had a certain experience. Twice I was threatened that my visa would be taken away. And once, because I was a British person working for a US news organization, when I went to the British embassy to ask what they would do to help me, I was told that I did not fall within the locus of their responsibility because I worked for a US news outlet. And so for a while, there was this trend of people who, people who were targeted for expulsion were those people who kind of fell between the stools like that. So I think there could be a lot more sort of coordination and a lot more attention on this, because honestly, the role played by the foreign media in reporting back, as Emily has so carefully outlined, is just really so important to us. And I think now, looking at the upcoming National Congress, it's quite astonishing how little we know. That black box of Chinese politics is, almost completely impenetrable to us. And one of the reasons is the lack of foreign correspondents in China and the lack of sources that they now have to speak to them. And I absolutely agree with what Emily says, that really doesn't serve China's interests. Sometimes it needs people to explain its actions to the world and explain its thinking. And, when people are being expelled in such numbers, and when visas are not being approved, then, China's ability to tell its own story is really limited.
Jennifer,
Sorry, go on.
Jennifer, you've published work about how information might that's not approved by the authorities might nonetheless get into China through various VPN-related outlets. How does that kind of alter the story that we've been discussing here?
I think it maybe at the margin alters some things, and then in other things it doesn't alter at all. So I think in terms of something like the Party Congress, elite politics have always been completely impenetrable. Maybe in some periods of time they were slightly less completely impenetrable, but now we're back to the completely impenetrable phase. I think another thing to keep in mind in terms of the effects of what the Chinese government is doing is that it gives then the Chinese government more opportunities to set the agenda for what is reported on. Big events, meetings, other types of events, which are managed at a time set by the government then become the focal points of when reporting happen. In terms of non-institutionally managed flows of information, what my research has found is that for the most part, state media and Chinese government controls what information from the global information ecosystem flows into the country. But social media also plays a role in that information transmission. And there are individuals who we don't find any indication that they're associated with any governments or any media outlets who are transmitting information in and outside of the so-called China's so-called Great Firewall. We don't know if there are VPN users in China or if they are individuals who have Chinese social media accounts who are located outside of China who are funneling that information inward. I also wanted to just kind of pick up on a point that Emily mentioned in terms of US as a free media environment. Maybe the need for Chinese correspondents in the US is just in kind different than the value of foreign correspondents in China. I think this links to another point about the consequences of these actions for the Chinese government, which is kind of a more political science point, which is that without competitive media, those in power in political contexts where there are no national level elections are always doomed to be limited in what they know about what's going on in their own country. So I think the fact that the Chinese government were taking content reported on by foreign journalists in their internal discussions speaks to that. And now the Chinese government has limited domestic Chinese media, domestic Chinese independent media, foreign media. The sources of information that it has access to that are reliable are just diminishing. And so I think this is also another reason why in the long term, these types of strategies may not be beneficial, even from the perspective of the Chinese government that wants to stay in power. I think that then the open question is whether AI kind of solves all of this. And I think the response at this point is absolutely not, because even with a larger scale of data, you still have errors in machine learning training and biases. And these data are summarized for government consumption. And in the process of that summary, a lot will be left out. And so without kind of independent media, those in power in a place like China really lose access to reliable sources of information.
Before I turn this over to the questions submitted by our audience, I wanted to just point out that Louisa talked about positive inducements that the system offers to reporters from some countries, and it just made me wonder. It just made me wonder whether Emily has have they ever tried a good cop, bad cop act with you? Have they ever tried to mix inducements with kind of threats? Or has it just been consistently basically negative monitoring of what you've been doing?
That's a good question. I think in personal interactions, there's often a good cop, bad cop dynamic, especially since Chinese officials, particularly the foreign ministry, are not allowed to meet with people outside of their departments alone. They have to go with at least one other colleague. And that's to prevent people from straying from the official line or from defecting, say, if they're based abroad. But it's never been made super explicit. But certainly I've been told numerous times what the consequences would be for more negative coverage. And I guess the implication is that if you do want to maintain access, if you still want to stay in the country, that you have to be a little bit more positive. And of course, this is not a new threat. Like Louisa just described how the threat of expulsion, not having your visa renewed, always hangs over your head. And I think that's why it's important to think about how to tell the China story from outside of China. But that has always been there, and sometimes it's just deployed more directly than others. One issue that I wanted to touch on with what Jen was saying is not only does a lack of information discourse within a country lead to an inability to accurately understand as a leader what's happening in your country, but I think among citizens, among ordinary citizens, you've seen a proliferation of disinformation and misinformation because there is no central trusted news source or configuration of outlets that people will turn to and trust the information that comes out of that. And so you have a very interesting proliferation of self-published media, of social media, of bloggers and influencers all across Chinese social media apps and news sites, but they're not necessarily reliable, and there's no straightforward filtering mechanism to understand whether or not these are trustworthy sources. And so rightfully, the Chinese government is concerned about misinformation and disinformation. It has come out with different types of regulations to govern cyberspace and get rid of negative energy and only have positive information out there. So of course you can marry together a lot of political objectives about information control as well over very, very legitimate concerns about disinformation and misinformation within China. But it leads to confusion sometimes among its own citizens about what the heck is going on, and can stymie healthy discourse about real concerns, like at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, when there was just a complete dearth of official information about how people were getting sick and how many people were getting sick, where and when. And you had people on WeChat offering to sell like masks and offering theories about where it came from, and just kind of sowing huge amounts of panic. At the same time, it means that you've seen enormous creativity among Chinese journalists and content makers still, despite the political controls and censorship. Oftentimes you see it in entertainment and in long form kind of talk show type formats and audio, where it can be a little bit more difficult to immediately spot content that's sensitive and edit it out. For example, it's really easy to read a 500-word article and say, oh, this stuff needs to be censored, but it's more work to listen through a 90-minute talk show where maybe there are a few sentences that are slightly sensitive. So that space still exists, but it's a bit whack-a-mole, and stuff gets through, but you've got to wade through a lot of content. And I think there could be, from a soft power perspective, so much better domestic content made by very, very creative writers and journalists and content creators in China, but people often have to obscure or to make things longer or to talk in circles simply to get their stuff out there.
Thank you. We have a large number of questions. I'll try to cultivate them. Well, first is a statement. Thank you for your outstanding reporting on China. I'm a Uyghur teaching at Stanford. We deeply appreciate everything you have done to tell the world what has been going on in the Uyghur homeland. So that's a statement of appreciation. There is one question about one of the kind of depressing aspects of your talk was that it's increasingly difficult to do this kind of work in China. So someone asked, an anonymous attendee asked, what advice would you have for young journalists who want to become China foreign correspondents?
First of all, I think it's great that there's interest, and despite all the pessimistic things that I've just said, please do continue studying Chinese, studying China, with the goal of one day working and living there. At the same time, I would say, don't pigeonhole yourself. Find ways that China connects to other topics or to other places in the world, because that connectivity is what people are really interested these days. And I think it is where the more meaningful research and journalism about China is happening. And also look at ways that you can explore reporting beyond just text or beyond just audio in my case. Look at multimedia, look at data journalism. I so wish that I knew how to shoot footage and edit film, but just having as many of those skills under your belt as possible is also really, really helpful. And then one thing about journalism as a craft itself is I always tell people, I mean, go ahead and study journalism, go to journalism school if you feel like that's necessary. But I always find that the most interesting pathways for people who enter journalism are people who do it as a second career or who studied something completely unrelated to their current beat. It could be wildly far from what you're covering at the moment, but perhaps if I had studied like geology or something, then I would have done a much better story about, I don't know, mining in China 20 years in the future. Like you just never know when that expertise might come up. Whereas journalism is a skill, so you can always pick that up later in life. But just try to diversify as much as possible in terms of life experiences and skills.
Thank you. Another question from someone who I think is connected to Stanford. Thank you, Emily, for your insightful reflections. As someone who grew up in Beijing, who was just naturalized as a US citizen, what advice might you give individuals like me who still have concerns for family members back in China, but want to leverage our cultural understanding to tell meaningful stories without opening up our relatives to retaliation?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I have a clear-cut answer for that. I think sometimes people have to make tough choices, particularly when they're more public-facing about the relationships they want to maintain. Certainly, I have cut off connections to certain people to do the work that I've had to do. But I think that particularly if you're already in the US, that there is a hunger and a demand for China stories, and offering that expertise for long form storytelling can be less sensitive, but also therefore your input is also much more valuable because there's so much nuance and context that you can provide. I think that there are also ways to tell stories about China that have very little to do with politics, though unfortunately, I think what's absurd about sometimes reporting in China is you just never know what the red lines are and what will become red lines. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a really straightforward question. I think unfortunately that you've started to see people feel like they are not completely free to tell the stories they want to tell, even when they are not in China.
I guess one dimension of this is whether you as a reporter or reporters in general kind of withhold fire or self-censor to some extent when reporting, given the constant threat that you might not get your visa renewed. And I know that this charge has been made by, say, the editor of Foreign Policy magazine against academics who work on China, who don't read what we write in journals, but just assume, since we're not being quoted in the media every day, that somehow we're censoring ourselves and thereby indirectly supporting the regime. Do you think there's any of this tendency, either among yourself or your colleagues, to? I think you've already mentioned that you might word a story somewhat differently with the visa issue in mind. But it doesn't sound like this is a major issue.
I haven't changed a story or worded a story differently because of the threat of that, but it's just something that people do have to live with and be okay with if you are covering China, to know that you are paradoxically investing a huge amount of effort to understand a place, and to also be okay walking away from that kind of access at any moment. And that's why I think it's important, if people want to become a journalist and want to cover China, to diversify what they're interested in and what their skill sets are, because it is a fickle beat that can throw you off at any moment. I can't speak to what other journalists decide when they're making that calculus about access versus objectivity of reporting. I can imagine a situation in which someone has decided that a certain story probably isn't worth sacrificing their access. Long term, I think that if you continue to make this decision, that would impact the quality of your coverage, and actually is self-defeating for a journalist, because you're putting your name as a byline on every single story. So your reputation does matter. But China is very aware of the kind of leverage it can wield over individual journalists, or whether it's economic leverage, say, over a particular company, political leverage over a particular country or organization. And they're learning how to deploy that much more skillfully. And they're much more confident now, of course, using that power as well.
Well, the reason why I ask this question is that there is a question from the audience that has a little bit of a barb in it, and I think the question implies that foreign reporters in China tend to focus on negative stories in order to drive up readership. Okay, so let me just read it to you. It seems that negative news from China will draw more attention from the audience. How would U.S. journalism change that? Perhaps report more positive news?
I don't totally understand what the last part of the question is, but the first part is an interesting question. And it's one that I'm assuming the person is asking if how would more US journalists on the ground in China change that coverage? You know, I made no bones about this. What motivates me about my coverage is, yes, offering a comprehensive view of what's going on. I want to cover the news and make sure people know what's happening day to day. But what really motivates my reporting and what drove me to stay in China for almost 7 years is covering the kinds of stories that would not get covered if I didn't go out and travel to these places and make an effort to find these people and talk to them. And oftentimes stories that will go uncovered or censored within China are going to be stories the Chinese state considers sensitive or negative. And so, of course, yes, you're going to have a preponderance of coverage, enterprise coverage, that certain people in China are going to find negative. I never look at audience numbers. I could have access to that data, but I simply just don't have time or interest to look at that. When that data is tabulated, it will be sent to me usually a week or 2 weeks after a story goes out, but I just don't pay attention to that sort of stuff. What drives me is telling a good story, and knowing that that story would not exist if I didn't do it myself. If that story were being reported by state outlets, or it was being put out by a government press release, or 10 different outlets were rehashing the same subject in different ways, then I don't really see the value add that I have as someone who's made the effort and had the resources behind them for an organization to send them to China.
So we have maybe time for one or two more questions. One is by our colleague, Don Emerson, in the Asia Pacific Research Center. And it's essentially about reporting on elite politics in China. And his question, I'll boil it down. He says, essentially, if high-level politics is a black box, and there's all kinds of rumors that are flying around, does it make much sense to report on elite level politics? Can it be reliable at all, or are we simply recirculating rumors?
It's a fine balance. I think it would be completely defeatist to throw up our hands and say, this is impossible, let's not even try. At the same time, it's irresponsible to also just publish political speculation. And I think that foreign journalists always walk that fine line. There, again, are different sources of information people can leverage, and there are academics and analysts out there who I think do a fine job with the information they do have, looking at precedent, just crunching the numbers and tracking the career paths of literally hundreds, sometimes at a time, of Communist Party officials and how they've been promoted over the years, and guessing through induction and just through patterns what kinds of standards officials might be evaluated according to get promoted, and then making predictions based on that to see who will make it to the top echelons of the party. But I think what journalists can do is to offer context into why we have to do this in the first place, and what implication that might have in understanding what's happening, so that readers or listeners or watchers are aware of the kinds of judgment calls that we're making because Chinese politics is now a bit of a guessing game. I don't think that political elite politics is a black box only because of the repression of foreign journalists, by the way. It's also because people within the system, in the Chinese political system, have not been able to leak information and to communicate as openly as they have in the past. In some ways, elite politics used to be a much more gossip-driven and salacious beat than it is now, even though we are still dealing with mostly speculation and rumors, because people were leaking all the time. And so it actually became really, really difficult to assess whether like the rumor that you heard one day was compatible with a rumor that you heard the next day for the 19th and particularly the 18th Party Congress. We just don't have that kind of information flow coming out from the Chinese side as well. And of course, we also have few foreign correspondents to judge the quality of the information we are getting today.
I think I have one more question that I'll pose to you from the audience. And this basically is whether, essentially, do you have any inside information about when the zero COVID rule is going to end, or whether it can ever end, given the fact that COVID is not going away globally?
I think if you were to expect China to return to what it was like pre-2020, no, we will not see that. The public health monitoring infrastructure that's been built up at the grassroots level and national level will never be completely dismantled. And just the reality of more and more people living on this earth means that we will have more pandemics where some of the infrastructure actually might be useful. I personally don't think we will ever return to a China where you can simply just fly into the country with a visa and walk off the plane and go to a restaurant. I think it's it would not be out of my imagination to think that there will be a 3, 4, 5 day quarantine forever for entering China. And I don't think that the end of zero COVID will somehow magically start as soon as Party Congress ends. But we might see a bit of a gradual easing process over the next year. But it will be a transition, and it will take place over many, many years. It will not be all of a sudden.
Wow, that's really sobering. That's more pessimistic than I've heard before, but I take that quite seriously. So thank you very much. Thank you to the audience. Thank you, Jennifer and Louisa, and congratulations once again, Emily, on your terrific reporting and on this award. Yiwook?
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Andy. Also, thanks to Jen and Elisa for excellent panel discussions. And then once again, congratulations to Emily. As many people noted, we really appreciate your courage and professionalism in covering on China. So it has been a great pleasure to have you all join us this evening. And my sincere thanks to everyone who helped make this evening possible, especially our communication team led by Noah Wonkin. And we are grateful for the ongoing support of the Shorenstein family and from our many other friends and partners. So Emily, hopefully we can have you in person sometime in near future. And then good luck on your reporting on China. So thank you all and good night.